Welcome to our webinar, Rethinking Supply Chain Analytics. I'm your host, Helen King. Traditional supply chain technologies used relational database solutions and linear optimization. Data was largely batched and latent. In this new world, data moves at the speed of business, and data is enriched by insights from prescriptive and cognitive analytics. In this webinar, you will learn how this transforms supply chain strategies. Before I hand this over to Laura and the rest of our panel, there are a few things I want to cover with you. We're recording today's session, and we will post it on our on-demand webinars page. You can visit our website to listen to this or any of our past webinars. Additionally, we will send out the slides to all attendees, as well as a recording within 24 hours. We encourage you to share these slides with others in your organization, and if you have questions, reach out to Laura or myself to set up a discussion. We want to hear your questions about our findings, so please post to the Q&A function in the chat box on your screen. We've left time at the end of the webinar to address your questions. Finally, we will be live tweeting this webinar, so if you'd like to join the social media conversation, you can use the hashtag SCIWebinar and follow at SC Insights LLC during the event. Let me introduce our host, Laura Ciceri, founder of Supply Chain Insights. As an enterprise strategist, Laura focuses on the changing face of enterprise technologies. Her research is designed for the early adopter seeking first mover advantage. She comes to the stage with over 40 years of diverse supply chain experience. Welcome, Laura.
Well, thank you so much, Helen. And I want to thank my panel today, because what we try to do at Supply Chain Insights is provide the supply chain leadership teams around the world with open content from quantitative research. And then we use the research as a backdrop to really engage discussions. Today, I am joined by Bharat and Rick, and thought I'd let them introduce themselves. And what we're going to do is then share research and ask them to give you their perspective on the research. Bharat, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, Laura. Hi, Rick. Can you guys hear me okay? Can you hear me? Hello?
You sound perfect. Thank you. Yep,
Right,
we can hear
good.
you.
Perfect. So thank you again, guys, for having me. I am focused on digital transformation of the manufacturing and supply chain functions at Merck KGaA. I've been in this role for the past 10 years. I focus especially on descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive analytics, and I'm happy to share my view with you today and hopefully bring some value to the audience you have joining the session.
Well, great. We had over 450 people sign up, and people are still coming in, so it's a great topic. Rick, share a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, I'd love to. I'm very excited to be here today, so thank you for having me and asking me to be a part of it. I recently retired from the Kellogg Company after a very long career and after filling a number of different roles for the company. But over the last several years, I've spent the majority of my time in the data and analytics space, as well as kind of the BI approach and trying to really move the organization into that digital mindset. So really excited about being a part of today because I think that this is a critical conversation that all companies are having. So thank you.
Okay, and Rick, Charles says he can't hear you, so maybe we can turn up the volume just a little bit. I know we were playing with your headset before we got started. So what I try to do is invite people that are of different backgrounds. So Bharat is from pharmaceutical, Rick is from food and beverage. Rick and I are at a different age point than Bharat. We've been around a little longer. And the world of analytics has really changed. As I think about analytics, you know, in the old days, we built analytics really around latent data that was largely batch, and we didn't have clouds, and we didn't have streams, and we didn't have pools, and the analytics infrastructures were never designed to think about analytic architectures that could flow through clouds or streams or pools. And in fact, what we had were analytics that were really thought about more as an afterthought on what I call the alphabet soup of supply chain management. Alphabet soup meaning SRM, ERP, APS, PLM, CRM, we would typically bolt on analytics, and it often meant reporting on the back of what I call alphabet soup applications. Now, what's happening in the world of analytics is the building of cloud streams and pools in between our traditional applications and workforce productivity tools. And this formation of analytics and new capabilities is at the center of digital transformation and the art of the possible. So what we wanted to do was to gain insights from a quantitative study, and we fielded this quantitative study over the period of October to December. We had 137 respondents. We will be publishing the full report next week in our newsletter. And we asked for the perspective of business users across industry and also technology vendors to compare the differences in perspectives. The business users are predominantly from process manufacturing, and they're in modern trade. They're in Europe and North America, and they're representative of companies greater than 6 billion. So the average business user is in the business, not in IT. It's their perspective, and we contrast that to technology vendors. And many of the technology vendors that responded work for large technology companies, and it's very interesting to see their perspectives on analytic strategies, familiarity, investment, criterion, evaluation. And so what we're going to do today is share the differences in the perspectives. One of the things we find in the study is that users are more satisfied with their analytic strategies than vendors or technology providers believe them to be. And the technology providers are really seeing the art of the possible, and they're trying to push the line of business users to adapt the art of the possible, but it requires education and missionary selling. And as we look at analytic strategies, both groups agree that companies are not investing in analytic strategies to the degree that they need to be. Both groups feel that there's a lot going on and there's a need for investment. Now, how investment happens is often of question, because how should it be funded? Should it be funded through the business? Should it be funded through IT? Should we have an analytics center of excellence? And we find in the study for line of business users that 27% have an analytics center of excellence. And sometimes the analytics center of excellence can be rolled into the supply chain center of excellence, and roughly 1/3 of companies also have a supply chain center of excellence. But there is a need within the organization to understand the art of the possible, to understand some of the terms that I'm going to use today, and really question current supply chain processes and what they could be. Now, 18% of companies are among the first to try technologies, and 45% are among the last to try. So we have a preponderance of people that are more laggard than early adopters. And that's one of the reasons why I was really excited that Bharat agreed to be on the call. Bharat, how does this compare to what you see at Merck?
Laura, I would say it lines up very well with what we observe at Merck. I would say in my company, Merck KGaA, we're lucky that we have a CEO who launched an initiative called Digitize Merck. So it's really coming top down, the focus on digital and analytics as a part of that. So we're somewhat fortunate in that we're forced to look into new analytic strategies and really make some tangible progress. But I think this lines up very well with what I observe in my company.
And Rick, you know, I know you've spent many years at the Kellogg Company, and you've also spent a lot of time in the industry. How does this compare to what you've seen in the industry?
Well, I think the information you had on the last few slides is really interesting, and I think that if you think about the first slide that you showed, where it shows the disparity between what users think and what vendors think around how robust they are with analytics, I think it really ties back to the realization that there's confusion within organizations on what analytics really mean. And so while the vendors can see the possibilities, the companies are caught in that mindset where they only know what they know. And so they may be satisfied to some degree with where they're at, but it's because they don't really recognize or realize the opportunities that may be passing them by because they're comfortable with their strategy. So I think that if the slide that you have up right now is really telling that so many are late to the party because of probably that barrier that they have in front of them where they just really don't understand, or there's confusion around what the promise of analytics is. So absolutely agree with you, Bharat, that the key is top-down support and driving that strategy and that understanding of being more outside in so that you can really understand what the opportunities are.
So any insights about how you course correct the confusion, Rick or Bharat? Because I find that vendors talk a language that the business users don't always understand, and people are busy, they're not sitting around waiting to learn about, what is the latest form of open source, or what is a rules-based ontology. They're busy. So how do we close the gap on confusion? Any insights?
Well, I think, Laura, between me and Rick, sorry, Rick.
Okay, keep going.
I think we addressed both points that I have in my mind. One is the top-down management sponsorship and support that then drives the teams below to really figure out how we can leverage analytics to drive business outcomes. And the other thing, I think Rick nailed that one, which is education. A lot of people that are in decision-making positions in various organizations could use some more education, should spend some more time really trying to understand basic things. What is descriptive versus predictive? What's predictive versus prescriptive? So when vendors engage them, they're ready to have a more mature conversation as opposed to just going down a path that they're not sure. So I think those are the two big keywords for me: sponsorship and awareness.
And education, I hear. Rick, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think that there's a missing element here, and that is who in the organization drives or possesses the intellectual curiosity to actually look out there and then take on that responsibility of educating. Because it's been my experience across the industry and within individual organizations that people are busy. In some industries, there's been a lot of optimization of resources. People have full-time jobs. Who really picks that up and drives it? And I think it's really a question that gets arisen to say is that do you have a change agent or champion within your organization that has the voice and the credibility to actually kind of drive that agenda and get that education in place? Because what people don't understand is that while we talk about analytics being a center of excellence, the reality is I think that for most companies it's still very functional and it's still very focused on traditional problems. So if that's the case, then somebody has to help them understand how you can use this to actually take you into a step change direction. And that's what I think is missing for most companies.
Well, let's continue here, and we're still getting some feedback, Rick, that hard to hear, so I don't know if you can turn up a little bit. But 1/4 of business users are satisfied with the ability to get data within the enterprise, and we're not able to get business-to-business data either from the network. So, we're not able to get data at the speed of business, and people want to do that, and many times people feel like they're in very long and drawn out traditional implementations like enterprise resource planning or advanced planning. So when we look at analytics, as it looks at the center of the diagram that I showed you, which has alphabet soup analytics on the left-hand side of ERP, APS, SRM, and workforce productivity on the right-hand side, in the middle, we're working on data visualization. 57% of companies surveyed have deployments in data visualization. And these tools do not have optimization, so they don't have predictive analytics, they don't have prescriptive analytics. They're tools like Click and Tableau and Spotfire. We also are working on unstructured data mining. 23% of companies are working on unstructured data. And when we think about the supply chain, 75% of the data is unstructured, but most of the supply chain has been focused on structured data, transactional data. So this includes things like mining quality data, mining return data, looking at pictures and images, managing content for quality, artwork, etc. I could go on and on. 22% are looking at data lakes for data mining. And when we get into this, we're dealing with the shift to schema on read versus schema on write. So here, what we're able to do is put analytics on top of data lakes to be able to agilely manage the analytics to take data out of a passive data lake. 18% are looking at concurrent optimization, and this lacks a common definition in the market. The definition of someone like Kinaxis for concurrent optimization is very different than somebody like SAP. But they're looking at, how do I take the time horizons and the roles of optimization for planning and compress them? 18% are looking at text mining. 16% are looking at Internet of Things, which is moving streaming data architectures. And streaming data architectures are very different than current architectures. Many people are working on Apache Spark and open source. Sentiment analysis, which is looking at the mining of customer sentiment. Hadoop and open source analytics, which is moving to systems which are not built on relational databases, software robots, which allow us to be able to look at how do we automate functions within software, cognitive computing, which allows us to sense, learn, and act, and to be able to build off of rules-based ontologies to be able to have multiple ifs to multiple thens. Blockchain, 4%, drones. So one of the interesting technologies for drones is the ability to fly a drone in a warehouse, use machine learning for real-time inventory. So most of the work is happening around very basic visualization, some on Internet of Things. So Bharat, let me just ask, at Merck, how does this compare to where you're investing?
Well, Laura, I would say we do spend a lot of energy on data visualization, on data lakes, some level of investments in Internet of Things. So I think, again, it lines up what the industry is doing with what we're doing. What I would add to all the things you pointed out on the slide is that to some extent, we have to stop playing pretend and acknowledge that we have to first get the basics working before we get all fancy and talk about drones flying around in your warehouse, okay? I would argue that a lot of the audience that you have dialing in today are still more focused on getting the real business value on things that matter the most to their business, how to improve the service level, how to reduce the cost, how to free up inventory, things that digital can really become an enabler for, before going into some of the more complex advanced technologies. So what I'm trying to tell you is that A, this lines up with what happens at my company, and B, that we have more work as an industry to do in getting to a good foundation before we start to leap and fly into blockchain and AI and all those things. Does that make sense?
I don't know. I mean, sometimes, analytics can help us with basics. Like every company that I work with, one of the first things they complain about is master data. But machine learning and cognitive computing offer solutions, or, many times people are worried about lineage, and blockchain offers potential. So I'm not sure. This whole thing around basics versus, new forms of analytics is something I personally struggle with. Let's see what Rick thinks. Rick?
Yeah, then I apologize for my headset, because it you're only as good as your technology in this world today. So I apologize, but I'll hopefully it's clear enough that you can hear me. So I think that this slide is so incredibly useful, because it shows how many different things are going on in the world, and people have a difficult time focusing on more than a few things at once. So while each of these areas hold promise, I think people are struggling with, how does this apply to me, and how can I actually leverage this, and for which problems or which opportunities should I be leveraging these different pieces for? So I think that this is where part of the confusion comes from. It's just the world is changing so fast. There are so many opportunities that it makes it very difficult for people to prioritize.
Yeah, and I think that many of the technologies that we have today are being redefined. Like in 2002, we thought we were going to write to ERP for many more things than I think we're going to write to ERP today. And many times people are on multi-year ERP journeys, or they've been on EDI journeys so long that some of the art of the possible starts to question, some of the fundamental architectures we have today. Bharat, your thoughts there?
Yeah, Laura, I tried to chip in a bit earlier as well. See, the point is, in digital transformation, what's more important is the transformation. Okay, here this slide is talking about all the digital, the tools in our toolkit. But what's the real value? What's the real goal? The goal is to change the way people work to drive business outcome. That's transformation. Okay. Today we talk about blockchain. Tomorrow it's going to be something else. 5 years later, it will be yet another thing. So to really make the leap towards transformation, we need to look at how our transactional systems work, because most of these tools are overlaid on top of our transactional systems. If we use systems from 20 years ago that store and process data in a certain way and put fancy analytics platforms on top, it's not going to cut it. We got to rethink our thinking to go outside in instead of inside out, adopt more modern transactional systems, and then that will fuel better adoption of analytics platforms, which can bring the intelligence on top. Does that answer your question?
It does, but let's continue to move on, because when we look at the views of the vendors and the views of the business users, and we ask, what will be disruptive in 5 years? What will change? And, this gets to digital value-based disruption. And then what do we believe will be lower? We see that some of the technologies that people are driving, text mining, sentiment analysis, data lakes, will be low disruption, but that the fundamental capabilities of cognitive computing, drones, blockchain, software, robots could be very disruptive. I believe that planning as we know it will be transformed and replaced in 5 years through cognitive computing, and that blockchain could redefine B2B. Now, it won't happen overnight, but we're headed that direction, and I think it'll be transformative. Internet of Things, the vendors believe that it'll be more transformative than the business users. Unstructured data, less disruption, but I think if we think about the movement for listening post or the ability to build outside-in processes, it could be at the center of digital disruption. Bharat or Rick, any thoughts on this slide?
Well, I think that this slide is very telling, because the reality is people are functionally literate, and they're literate in their current state and their current space. So you're absolutely right. I think these are going to be incredibly disruptive. I love Bharat's comments a few moments ago about transformation, because that's the critical element that people should be focused on. But these things will absolutely disrupt, and regardless of whether or not you want them to, I'm a firm believer it's going to happen. And I think that, for instance, the confusion around, if you talk about demand planning and then you talk about analytics, and that graying space in between the two things here makes it very important for people to understand that this is the way things are changing.
Yeah, I'm working with a client right now that's on a 5-year rollout of JDA technology that's 6 years old. And I'm like, wow, won't cognitive computing transform that, Or I'm working with a company that's questioning what's going to happen with SAP APO by 5 years from now. And I'm like, shouldn't we be asking the question about how does decision support get redefined? So the questions we ask and how we move forward, I think, can change based upon capabilities. Bharat, your thoughts?
Yeah, Laura, I really like this slide, and I think it's a good story it's saying, because the focus has been on two things in my mind. One is automation, which is through robots and drones and all the things we do, and then about autonomy. And this is where cognitive comes in, whereby machines are self-learning to think and act like a human and make optimal decisions, right? So first thing is, I think these technologies are relevant, and it's important to get a sense of what they are and how they can help your business. The other thing I would add is that if you have an analytics program, it's good to think about a lab/factory setup where you have, let's say, 70% of factory where you're working on things that deliver real business value, and you have 30% where you're building prototypes, where you play with cool, fun new technologies. So it's not one or the other. You spend most of your energy on things that will transform your business and have some time for looking into these new technologies and maybe running a pilot or two. That's what I would say for the audience listening in, and that these things are not for 10 years later. Look into them, but spend small percentage of your time, so you're not just doing the standard things, but looking ahead and testing some of these new technologies. Yeah.
I think it's a great point, but let's move on, because as people think about challenges, because I totally agree with you, Bharat, but the biggest issue is the alignment between business and IT. And the more I'm working in the field right now, I find that we've downsized business and we've got really a whole shift of manpower. Baby boomers have retired. People are coming into the roles that don't understand some of the history and development of things like supply chain planning or revenue management or trade promotion management, or the relationship between customer relationship management and demand planning, or how ERP evolved. And so a lot of the basics and the transition of the basics have been lost in both the organizations of companies that make products and also the technology space of consultants. In a similar way, the business is more focused on value, and IT has often become a managed cost. And we've downsized, we've right-sized, we've outsourced, and there's been a lot of decisions made assuming that the IT organization can get specialty skills when they need it, and those specialty skills aren't always available. So we've set up a real dichotomy between business and IT that makes it really difficult to make this transformation. In addition, we've got some employee skill issues, and we've got just a rate of change that I don't know has been precedent in most people's careers. So we've got some pretty big challenges, even if we've got leadership support and funding and knowledge. So Bharat, how do you feel about this? Any insights about how to close these major gaps?
Laura, I'm going to go straight for the topic that sticks out for me the most, which is the alignment between business and IT. Uh, at Merck KGAA, we're fortunate to have a really strong collaboration. Okay, and I personally believe that this is a prerequisite for success if you're really driving an analytics or a digital transformation program. And let me tell you something. I'm thinking about your audience that's dialed in, and when I speak to a lot of the folks in the industry with a similar intent, I know digital is important. I know analytics is important. I see the value. I've been tasked with the responsibility. Where do I start? Who do I work with? Should I go internal with my IT organization? Should I bring in a consultant? This is the standard set of questions that I hear. What I would say to that is that it's important to pick your choices wisely, because you may go faster initially if you work with an external consulting group. But if you sort of leave your IT organization out of the equation and pull them in later when you need to go productive inside your environment, you may not get the support you need. So my point of view is that for us in my company, it's really a big reason for our success is collaboration. So I would really encourage to bring your IT partners to the table sooner than later. Okay. And then I would say the other thing I would say is that sometimes if you create an us versus them mentality where your internal IT group feels like, oh, we're not special and we have to do the age-old data warehouse, and for all the cool big data stuff, here comes a consulting company, then you may be creating some passive aggressive behavior that's not going to help you win in the end. So I would really encourage people on the call to think about how they're going to align with IT and how they're going to avoid the sort of friction in the end.
Yeah, and I encourage people to also be sure that they're asking the right resources. I find a lot of times, digital's kind of on this manic behavior route that everybody's talking about digital, but very few people know supply chain and digital. But Rick, your thoughts here about closing the challenges and the gaps? Because I know you've worked on this a long time.
Yeah, I actually have. Well, I think that the key here, when you look at it, the first thing that jumps out is talking about the rate of change and how how it is rampant in today's world and the things that we're faced with, and then how do you get organizations to move forward? Well, number one, change management is difficult within any organization that I've ever met. So I think that you already have an uphill battle when you get ready to try to go down the transformation path. But the other side of that is that the IT and the business has to find a way to work together to make it sustainable, regardless of whether or not you start on the outside. Most companies they have an analytics and strategy in place. I mean, they're really expecting to be able to leverage that strategy for competitive advantage, for cost optimization, for a number of wins. And you have to embed that skill set and that capability within your organization if you're going to approach it from that perspective. So it's quite the dilemma for companies, I think, but IT and the business has got to figure out a way to work together to make it sustainable and to be able to move forward.
So the research says that the more business process outsourcing people have done, the harder it is. Where they've got career paths that don't allow people to experience both IT and business, the harder it is. When there's not shared leadership, the harder it is. So for many people, it's a tough question. But when we look at the analytics strategies, people are looking at Internet of Things, and they're looking at preventative maintenance, manufacturing automation, VMI, ocean container movement, tank sensing, rail movement, wearables. We've got a lot of work happening on the Internet of Things. Bharat, are you doing any work in this area?
We have some Internet of Things pilots that we're running. There's been some good initial results. I wouldn't say we've gone out and conquered the technology, but we're seeing some good initial results.
Any advice you would have for people that are looking at Internet of Things pilots?
I always go back to ROI and value. Don't play with technology for the sake of playing with technology. And if you do that, then you will use the technology to drive to an outcome. And then it builds more momentum. Simple stuff.
So build with the goal in mind. Rick, your thoughts?
Well, I think he's exactly right. And I think that that's why you see so much activity and so many desires in that space, because the outcomes are easily measured. So it's much easier to put together a pilot where there's an opportunity that's, a hard cost savings. And so when you think about the pilots that are taking place, and I've seen a number of them, some go better than others, I think that's why, because it's really easier to tie that to the traditional investment models that we are utilizing, although that might not be where the greatest opportunities are.
Yes. And I think the whole digital manufacturing space, where we're redefining when to take equipment down, sensing off of equipment, Internet of Things, streaming data architectures is where we see the most activity. Now, in unstructured data mining, we see it in social sentiment, so the mining of customer data, the mining of quality data, looking at rating and review data. We see less on warranty data, supplier risk management data. Bharat, are you working in any unstructured data mining applications?
Yeah, Laura, we have some internal experiments where we take data actually from within the systems within Merck, but unstructured data, and then try to glean that data to get insights, actionable insights that we couldn't get before. For confidentiality reasons, I can't quite tell you what sort of things we're doing, but I can tell you we're playing a lot in that space with internal data from our systems.
Well, I encourage the teams that are trying to manage the art of the possible to really brainstorm, list all the unstructured data sources, and then look at the problems that happened over the year and ask the question, if they could mine the unstructured data, could they enrich the business decisions? Because most people are so focused on structured data, transactional data, that they haven't really thought about unstructured data. Rick, your thoughts here?
I've been involved in a number of these efforts, but I think that what's telling here for me is that I think this is an area of huge opportunity. When we talk about being outside in, I think the problem is that for this particular space. Most companies are outside in, but only facing south or facing north. They're not 360, because I think that there's also a huge opportunity upstream to leverage this data, and I've seen very few efforts or initiatives that really are going back into the supplier side of things. It's more the downstream.
And with our dependency on more outsourcing and whether it's artwork management or active ingredients or contract manufacturing, we talk about that we have networks, but, we don't really think about, what that means. So guys, any surprises for the survey? Anything else you'd like to add or advice? Bharat?
Yeah, Laura, one big surprise for me is around value and ROI. Maybe it's a question for you. Was there any specific questions around how many of the people you surveyed were seeing measurable business results? Is that something you asked?
Yes. And interestingly, people look at ROI as a strong driver for rationalization, but we don't know the ROI of these projects. And in the open text mining, we find out that the test and learn strategies often will give greater ROI than a traditional project plan where you have a guesstimate of ROI and you do a project analysis based upon a presumed ROI. So test and learn, fail forward is actually giving a greater ROI than the traditional approach. Thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that, Laura, and I think that's a lot of what we're doing as well. My point is that you don't need an Excel sheet with NPV analysis to say you're going to invest X and you're going to return Y to the business in X years. That's a traditional approach. What I'm saying is that I see a lot of digital projects which start without a clear end in mind. People are not able to articulate what success looks like when you're done and how you'll have changed the way people work as a result of the product that you just developed. I'm just urging the audience you have to really think about that. What's going to be the outcome? And don't get drawn into the coolness of playing with digital tools, because it's all about the result.
Yeah, I agree. And often people will say they want to be digital without defining digital, or they want to have supply chain excellence without defining what supply chain excellence means. And I think that's a big watch out. So thank you for your feedback. Rick, any other items to cover here?
I just wanted to say that I agree with Bharat on his last comments. I think that it's very important to start with a goal in mind, but I also think it's important as you go down that trajectory that you take the blinders off, because you may be unlocking and uncovering opportunities along the way that a myopic focus might cause you to pass them right by. So I think that it's important to kind of step outside of the comfort zone. And we talk about being flexible for customers, we talk about being flexible for consumers and building a flexible and agile supply chain. And yet, when we talk about test and learn, it seems like we're not always all that flexible. It seems like we're somewhat rigid in our approach, and it can be very difficult to get these pilots in place. And I think that the organization, if they really want to advance in this area, they need to think about how they do that. Not taking your eye off value, but being more flexible in the way you approach it.
Yeah, I agree. And so we've got a couple of questions here. One is, are we going to share the slides? Of course, we're going to share the slides. And we're going to post the slides on SlideShare, and we're also going to post the webinar. And then there's a question about embedding and processes. How do you take the art of the possible and redefine it into processes? And this is one of the things that I see where, if you start with small pilots, test and learn, and then you have some stage gate processes, then you can evolve. Bharat, how do you do that at Merck?
Well, let me explain with an example. Okay, so in terms of the processes itself and how we design them, we have a big year-long process for measuring the performance of our manufacturing and supply chain organization. Okay, today it's driven a lot through Excel, and there's a lot of input that comes in every quarter, and it becomes one big fat Excel in the end. So what we are trying to do is not do a lift and shift of what's been done already, saying, oh, here are our KPIs, let's automate them and make it digital, make it daily, make it real time. But we're saying, guys, let's go back to the drawing board, because these KPIs and measurements were defined from a decade ago when we didn't have all these capabilities. If you could have data on a daily basis on your smartphone or on a real-time basis, what are the real KPIs that we want? Do we even need to measure all of them? And what kind of actions would we take with all these newer capabilities, with these digital capabilities that we couldn't take before? So I would say it's crucial to not just lift and shift old way of working, but to go back to your original process and to ask the question, how does digital change fundamentally how we do the work? And is there an opportunity to revamp our business process before slapping technology on top of it?
Yeah, Rick, your thoughts?
I think that the first key here for me in this question is that I see a lot of organizations and a lot of processes where the current state's not even very well understood or has been mapped appropriately, so that you really don't know the starting point that you're at. So I think that that's critical, just to make certain that there's a full understanding of the process. And then the piece that I think is quite eye-opening is that we tend to define end-to-end processes still within the walls of our organization. And, technologies like blockchain promise something far greater, that the end-to-end process goes across organizations and, from the upstream to the downstream. And if you can look at it like that, then it gives you a totally different view on the world, and it unlocks the areas where you may focus that are quite different from the way we've traditionally defined our processes being end-to-end, but within our own walls.
Thanks, Rick. Christine asked the question about, give an example of unstructured data and the use of technologies and how it drove value. Rick, do you have an example?
Well, I mean, there's a number of different examples, but for us, for instance, and in my prior roles, we looked at things like sentiment for innovation, just to get a better understanding very quickly on what we might be able to do or to modify to make certain that we adapt. So there's a number of different examples, but that would be one.
Bharat, do you have an example?
Yeah, Laura, I have some really cool examples, but I can't talk about it. What I can tell you is we're not getting unstructured data from Facebook or Twitter or YouTube videos. We're looking at unstructured data from within the organization, and we're really able to develop some cool solutions on top of that. So I apologize, I can't really highlight what they are, but that's really working for us.
And that's fine. The next question is around blockchain and where are we seeing value on blockchain. One of the things that I find very interesting are new applications for streaming data and blockchain within manufacturing to be able to look at track and trace across translation or transfer points. Things like dryers, blenders, tanks. We also see the use of blockchain for safety of materials in trucks and containers to look at when were things washed out, or lineage of where were things sourced from. We have some active tests that we're working on with the network of networks that is really around lineage, and to be able to look at, where are we on the maturity of blockchain technologies, things like the Hyperledger project and R3 Cordis and Ethereum. We also are looking at, supply chain finance. Anybody that's interested in blockchain, I would encourage you to join the Network of Networks group, where we're actively testing blockchain capabilities. Not a lot of people are actually moving in that direction. It's a lot of capabilities that I think are very promising. The technologies are very new, and we're finding out a lot as we go along. So I'm just going to wrap up now. First of all, I appreciate people joining us today. We had a great audience. I think analytics is really changing. We're moving to the cloud. We're moving with pools. It's really redefining IT strategies. It's much more than transactional data. It needs to really be thought of in concert with digital transformation. And as we do that, we've got to realize it's not your mother's old-fashioned supply chain. So many of the processes that we've talked about for a long time change and have the opportunity to
Okay, it looks like Laura's having some sound difficulties. But we do thank you all for joining us today.
Be radically transformed. Things like. Thank you, Helen.
No problem, Laura. A few things before we wrap up. As I mentioned, we will send out the slides and a recording link to everyone. So keep an eye out for that in a follow-up email from us. We also encourage you to engage with us on social media by following us on Twitter, joining our LinkedIn company page, and following us on SlideShare. You can find all this information in the slide deck. Thank you.
Helen, can I just maybe quickly add one thing if we still have time?
Yes, absolutely.
I just want to, inform the people that you have on the call that if anybody wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn to further the conversation, I'm happy to engage in the dialogue and be of help in sharing what we do and so on and so forth. So just throwing it out there for your audience, okay?
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Rick, any closing comments?
No, the same. Obviously, always happy to discuss this. This is a space that I'm very passionate about, and I think that it's changing the market environment as we speak. So I really appreciate being a part of today, and please reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thanks.